Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Spring 2022 Virtual Book Talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture here at the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History at AAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. As always, with me is AAS Digitization Coordinator, Amanda Kondik. Today's guest is Reed Gochberg, who in a few moments will share a presentation on her new book, Useful Objects, Museums, Science, and Literature in 19th Century America, published by Oxford University Press. For those who are interested in purchasing their own copy of the book, OUP has provided us with a discount code for 30% off the title, which will be provided shortly in the chat. Before introducing today's guest, I would like to briefly introduce the Society for Newcomers. AAS was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're dedicated to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. And as a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. In addition to this virtual book talk series, we have a variety of public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships, and we welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects. Now I would like to turn things over to Amanda, who will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. The chat function is open, so please send your comments to everyone. Throughout the presentation, I'll also be posting additional information and links in the chat relating to our speaker, AAS, and FIVAC. And you should be able to save the chat by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me in the chat. For the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for our speaker during or after their presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you will also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by selecting the thumbs up icon, and we'll answer these questions at the end of our program. Closed captioning is also available as an option for this afternoon's program via Zoom's live transcription function. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC. And finally, I would like to let everyone know we are recording this program and we'll be posting it on our website and YouTube channel. So thank you, Kevin, back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda. And now on to our program. Reed Gochberg is Assistant Director of Studies and a lecturer on history and literature at Harvard University, where she also teaches in the Museum Studies program at Harvard Extension School. Her research and teaching broadly focuses on 19th century American literature and culture, the history of science and technology, museum studies, and material culture. Reed's work has appeared in journals such as J19 and Early American Literature, and she received the 2019 Richard Beale Davis Prize for Best Article in Early American Literature. She also recently guest curated an online exhibit on Women of the Museum, 1860 to 1920, at the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. Finally, in 2016, Reed held the Barbara L. Packer Fellowship here at AAS. And with that, I'd like to welcome Reed Gochberg.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin and Amanda, for that introduction and for all of your work organizing this event and really this entire series, which has been such a fantastic way to learn about other scholars' work over the last couple of years. I also want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here today. It's really an exciting moment for me to get to share my work with all of you in this community and to return virtually to the AAS, where I had such a wonderful experience back in 2016 as a research fellow. So I'll be speaking broadly today about my book, Useful Objects, Museums, Science, and Literature in 19th Century America. And before I get started, I just want to share my screen so that I can share a few images with you today. So I wanted to start off with an example, which is pulled from the pages of a periodical and actually first introduced to me through the Just Teach One Early African-American Print Culture series that is sponsored by the AAS. So this is the serialized story, African-American Picture Gallery, which was first published in 1859 and written by the author William J. Wilson. So African-American Picture Gallery feels very prescient in many ways. Across 7 installments, Wilson imagines a museum dedicated to Black history and culture. It begins in the mode of a museum catalog, starting with descriptions of portraits, historical paintings, and landscapes, and imitating the handbooks and guides to museum spaces, while simultaneously imagining the kinds of objects and images such a museum could include. But as it goes on, it starts to experiment with form and narrative. In later installments, visitors actually start to show up to the gallery that they've theoretically been reading about in earlier issues of the magazine. At times, it's a kind of strange and convoluted story and kind of delightfully weird in this way, as these elements combine to really highlight this interplay between imagined museums, their audiences, and broader social debates about their purpose. So by incorporating the museum catalog, the descriptions of visitors, and the entrepreneurial goals of this museum's founder, Wilson's sketch begins by gesturing to kind of conventional ways of talking and reading about museums during the mid-19th century. However, its particular focus on African-American history marks a moment of advocacy for the kinds of knowledge that had explicitly been left out of most museums at this time. By emphasizing stories of slavery, freedom, and resistance, this sketch imagines how future museums could incorporate this history more fully. But at the same time, these serialized installments also really highlight the relationship between visiting museums and reading about them. Even as the sketch uses fiction to advocate for future museums, it's also emphasizing the interactions between these galleries and these other kinds of written descriptions, and showing how they create audiences, invite visitors, and spur larger conversations. By the end of the final installment, the original structure of descriptions of individual works has fallen away, and it's been replaced by these dynamic movements between the works on display, the museum's founder, and its rapidly growing audience in person and in print. So I begin with this story because I think it illustrates many of the key themes and approaches that I explore in Useful Objects. These moments illustrate how museums were part of dynamic conversations within American culture during the 19th century, raising questions about what museums choose to collect and value, how visitors engage with collections, and who participates in the process of determining what counts as knowledge. These conversations extended beyond the walls of institutions themselves, and they played out in print forms such as magazine articles, fiction, and essays. These kinds of questions are central to my work in this book, and in my talk today, I want to emphasize a few points. So first, about the kinds of shifts that were taking place during the late 18th and early 19th century in the scope and mission of museums. Second, about the broader challenges and debates that surrounded these collections that are illuminated through the accounts and perspectives of writers and artists and visitors. And finally, about the contemporary stakes of these discussions for how we think about collections today. So museums have a fascinating, complicated, and often troubling history. Scholars commonly trace their origins back to early modern Europe, when individual collectors created cabinets of curiosities that were filled with a wide range of fossils, natural history specimens, artifacts, and other objects returned from voyages around the world. The rise of colonialism shaped this idea of curiosity. It stood for discovery and wonder, but it also often stood in for otherness, for a Eurocentric view of the world. To these collectors, such objects were rare, and curiosity was in the eye of the beholder. As time went on, many collectors increasingly were looking to have representative as well as rare objects in their collections in order to create what one called a world in miniature, an encyclopedic collection that could attempt to account for the study of all branches of knowledge. So during the 18th century, these individual collections would form the basis of more public, large-scale museums such as the British Museum. And around the same time, many royal collections of art were being transformed into public institutions in Europe, such as the Louvre, and the National Gallery. These institutions were really important models for the kinds of museums that were being established in the United States and for the aspirations of their founders. It was not until later in the 19th century that we see the rise of the specialized large-scale museums like the MFA here in Boston, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Museum of Natural History, these museums that were founded by wealthy corporate tycoons in major cities. The Smithsonian was also established in the mid-19th century at a time when many other smaller collections were taking shape. And I've been really interested in this kind of in-between moment. So if we read forward from the 18th into the 19th century, we can see this very gradual and messy and non-linear transition from a kind of cabinet of curiosities model, a collection filled with natural history specimens, antiquarian artifacts, anthropological materials, technological models, prints, books, and so forth, towards greater specialization, from collections imagined much like libraries as repositories of objects to be read and consulted, to those imagined as displays, and from institutions restricted to elite audiences to those dedicated, at least ostensibly, to public education and access. We can also see how these transformations in museums were far from inevitable, and they were surrounded by intense debate and reflection about the role of objects and institutions in American social and cultural life. So one important thing to note about this period is that the very idea of a museum was in flux. We can see this in the varied terms used to describe collections at this time. You might see terms like cabinet, gallery, or museum. And these collections were housed in many different locations, from libraries and historical societies to academies, lyceums, and colleges. Despite these different contexts, however, these institutions shared a lot of resonances in how their purpose was being imagined and even in the language that they would use to describe them. Their founders often shared their mission in acts of incorporation and other kind of opening grand speeches, and they often emphasized this idea of useful knowledge. And this is where the title of the book comes from, Useful Objects. They suggested how material objects could make knowledge itself more tangible and concrete. Additionally, they made lofty claims about a broader mission of research and education. Museums committed to preserving objects for posterity, and they promised a kind of democratic access to knowledge. However, by reading these sources more critically, of course, and incorporating other kinds of materials and contexts, we can often account for and acknowledge the more troubling histories behind collections, patterns of elitism, exclusion, theft, and dispossession, and how museums were shaped by racism and colonialism, and how often very limited audiences were able to engage with collections or claim authority. So in Useful Objects, I bring together literature, the history of science and technology, and museum studies in order to trace how these conversations were playing out in American culture. Throughout the book, I examine accounts of museums across fiction, essays, guidebooks, and periodicals, and I place these in conversation with the kinds of information that we can get from donation books, visual materials, and even surviving objects from these collections. One thing I want to suggest about this period is that it really requires this kind of interdisciplinary approach. During this time, museums were bringing together so many different kinds of objects and materials from across what we would now today consider to be different fields: botany, zoology, anthropology, history, geography, and many others. These collections are often now housed separately at museums, libraries, or archives across these different disciplines. But their early history invites us to recall the proximity between these collections and the various figures who engaged with them. So we can also see how these collections invited creative and imaginative responses as visitors reflected on what they saw in the galleries and often considered alternative interpretations. I see this as both a kind of opening up of the history of museums beyond institutional records, a chance to draw different kinds of connections, to show their shared histories, but also a way to illuminate the voices and experiences of people who are often left out of these official histories. So if we look at accounts and descriptions of gallery tours and individual objects, we can consider some of the hierarchies and power dynamics of colonialism and elitism that shaped what was considered worth preserving and who would have access to the knowledge represented within museum collections. The Native American poet Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, who was the wife of a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent, reflected on the relationship between white and indigenous forms of knowledge making in her poetry and in their own literary co-authored works. The Black abolitionist and activist William Wells Brown interpreted works of classical sculpture in the galleries of the British Museum, staking a claim to his right to an education in his own expertise. And the artist Ora White Hitchcock, who was married to geologist Edward Hitchcock here in Massachusetts, and who is an expert illustrator of scientific texts, marveled at the collections of natural history that they saw together on their travels, but also noted the value that she imagined her husband taking from them and not herself, perhaps knowing that this was all too true. Much like the fictional visitors to African American Picture Gallery, their reflections invite us to consider how museums were defining their public and how their categories of useful knowledge were often being contested and challenged throughout this period. So these conversations also often involved explicit reflections on the relationship between books and other kinds of objects, and between writing and other kinds of material information and knowledge production. In the early Republic, the French-born writer and diplomat J. Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur reflected on challenges of materiality and loss in his writings, imagining the precarity of the objects circulating and being exchanged by institutions. The writer and naturalist Henry David Thoreau mourned his decision to kill a turtle in order to donate it to Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, even as he recognized its potential value to scientific research. And in the galleries of the US Patent Office, surrounded by models of patented machines, the poet Walt Whitman confronted the strange spectacle of a museum transformed into a Civil War hospital, capturing the eerie scene of cases of objects interspersed with wounded soldiers. Within museum galleries, writers were prompted to reflect explicitly on what kinds of information books and other objects offer and the limits and possibilities of each. So the founders of museums often envisioned a kind of order, picturing collections neatly arranged in cases and in cabinets, and imagining a process for determining what we can know and value through material objects. But these collections instead set in motion a series of dynamic conversations, both within and beyond institutions, about what we choose to preserve and value, about whose knowledge and experience is celebrated or erased, and about who has access to the knowledge and education represented by cultural institutions. These questions continue to resonate in conversations about these institutions today, and my hope is that understanding the longer history of these issues can help us think creatively about how to interpret the objects that were collected during this time, and can inform how we think about making these institutions more inclusive, interdisciplinary, and community-oriented spaces today. So with some of these larger questions in mind, I want to turn to just one example from the book and highlight the challenges that faced some of the earliest museum collections in the United States. So I especially want to emphasize the close proximity between museums and libraries during this period, and how these collections were shaping much broader concerns about preservation, loss, and instability. Many of you may already be familiar with Charles Wilson Peele's Philadelphia Museum, which brought together art and natural history and combined education and entertainment. This museum tends to be the best known example of museums in the early Republic, not incidentally because of how good Peele himself was at marketing it. But today I'm going to put this museum in conversation with another extremely nearby collection, which was the Cabinet of the American Philosophical Society. The society was founded in the mid-18th century by Benjamin Franklin with the goal of preserving and promoting useful knowledge. It conducted regular meetings, it formed a library, and also maintained a cabinet. So it was one of numerous smaller collections being developed during this time, often within a library, historical society, or scientific society. And many were intended to function a lot like libraries, to consult objects alongside books, to loan them out, of course, to a very limited audience, and at times, but not always, to house them together. So you see examples of this really across a lot of the institutions founded in the late 18th and early 19th century, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Lyceum of New York, the Boston Athenaeum, and of course here at the American Antiquarian Society. All of these institutions had cabinets that looked very similar to the one at the American Philosophical Society. At this time, the Harvard College also had what was called a philosophy chamber. It was a kind of teaching collection that it also included instruments and apparatus. Yale College also had a small museum at this point. There are numerous examples of these. So the American Philosophical Society's cabinet was explicitly wide-ranging in the kinds of objects that it included. And in many ways, this was the result of a kind of haphazard collecting process. Objects were often sent to the society by corresponding members. So these are people who lived outside of Philadelphia that still were considered members of this scientific community, and perhaps alongside some kind of written account of an interesting natural or chemical phenomenon observed at the same time. The term cabinet was somewhat of a misnomer. The society frequently struggled to find space to store its collections, and objects were often loaned out to members in Philadelphia and were therefore scattered, circulated, rather than held in one place. This posed fairly obvious organizational challenges, and at one point the curators announced that many objects had been, quote, entrusted to the care of members, but never yet delivered to the society. Things got lost. So to some extent, this speaks to a somewhat different purpose for a museum than what we often imagine today. At this moment, the point was use, observation, frequent handling. By circulating objects, they were much more likely to be used in an individual member of the society's research, and they were also entrusted to people who were known to be interested in that field, to be working on similar kinds of projects and so forth. The goal was for the collection to contribute to useful knowledge through these kinds of research, but preservation and longevity were therefore not major concerns. The collections were meant to be used even if it meant that they didn't last. So these issues of loss and preservation were especially significant given the period of time that this collection was being formed, which overlapped with the American Revolution and the founding of the early Republic. During the war, curators reported the decay of many specimens in the collection. Their attention was quite obviously elsewhere, and some collections dried out due to insufficient alcohol in the jars, in their words, the spirit used to preserve them. And even following the war, things stayed a bit chaotic. The society was looking to build a more permanent space, but the collections continued to move around. So this moment raises significant questions about how we think about the nature of building institutions, about scholarly work, about knowledge production during an age of crisis. Following the war, the curators of this cabinet were directly confronting the materiality of this collection and really having to grapple with just how useful these dried out objects would ultimately be, and having to manage the practicalities of misplaced objects. And we see such concerns resonating even further in the writings of one literary-minded donor to the cabinet. In 1789, Krevker donated what the curators described as a curious book, an interesting specimen. They described it in the donation books as the specimen of a curious book, the leaves of which are made of the roots and barks of different plants and trees, the first essay of the inventor. So here you can see a few pages from this book. This was a book of paper samples, each one made of different materials and different kinds of plants. And you can see across these the different texture, even the different color that you can see on the individual pages. But here we can also see how this object blurred the lines between book, artifact, and specimen, between a natural and artificial or man-made object, and between library and museum. So throughout his own writings, Krevker is constantly preoccupied with materiality and the possibility of loss. He's best known for writing Letters from an American Farmer, an epistolary work that takes as its structure the conventions of sociability, networks of scientific exchange, and the interchange of letters and objects during the Enlightenment. Throughout that work, he makes numerous analogies between writing and plant collecting, especially the dried and pressed flowers within an herbarium. And these botanical metaphors invite us to think about the curious book itself alongside these writings. In his later multi-volume work, The Journey Through Northern Pennsylvania and New York, he takes as the premise the idea that the work itself is a shipwrecked, waterlogged manuscript. It's a kind of similar conceit to what you later see in a work like Washington Irving's A History of New York, where Krevker seems to delight in framing this work by imagining its potential loss. So Krevker's writings highlight the broader thematic, metaphorical, and archival implications of his donation, but the history of the curious book itself also offers a kind of unique window on these questions. Much like other donated objects, it was almost lost. It was passed along to a member of the society, Benjamin Smith Barton, who was a doctor and botanist, and so he was clearly a fit for the interests that it represented. But Barton forgot to return it. He actually wrote his own name on the flyleaf, and then after his death, it was donated back to the society, very generous. But in general, he wasn't the best at keeping track of the objects that technically belonged to the American Philosophical Society. And he also famously misplaced some portions of the Lewis and Clark herbarium. And we can see through these examples how these recurrent problems of circulation and loss, usefulness and decay are playing out within this single collection, and even through a single object. So here's where we come back to Peale and his museum. Peale was a member of the society, and he had begun his own museum that he ran out of his house, but by the early 1790s, he was looking for more space. So in 1794, Peale was not only in charge of his own museum, he was also the curator of the society's cabinet. And he also applied for permission to rent space from the society in Philosophical Hall, right across the street from Independence Hall, where the museum would later move. He framed this as a moment of mutual benefit. He could offer his own skills at preservation to the society and implicitly help with issues of decay, and he would use this space for his own museum. So given his dual roles, I think it's very likely that he was also displaying some of the cabinet's collections alongside and within his own museum. So here we see the kind of learned society colliding with the idea of a public museum. So in his speech to members of the society in 1792, Peale emphasized his skill at the material aspects of running a museum. And I should say here that his goal was mostly to appeal for money. He talks extensively about the costs of things like glass cases, gilt frames, and other supplies that he needs to create the orderly cases and cabinets that you see depicted in images of the museum. And it's a really fascinating document just for thinking about the material process of running and maintaining a museum at this moment. But he also goes into a lot of detail about his methods of taxidermy, his skill of preservation, and visitors to the museum often especially commented on the birds as being quite lifelike. And a few specimens even survive today, which is pretty unusual for natural history collections from this time. But in this speech, things then take a pretty strange turn. In this appeal, he brags that he's so good at preservation that he even considered taxidermying the bodies of the founding fathers for display in his museum, quote, to preserve and hand down to succeeding generations the relics of such great men by the use of powerful antiseptics. He notes that he's pretty sure that the society's founder, Benjamin Franklin, would have been on board. And this is an unexpected proposal for a lot of reasons. That said, one thing it highlights is this kind of broader instability that surrounded these institutions. Fears of loss and decay are not just about collections or individual objects, they're also about the stability of the new-ish republic. This desire to keep the founders in sight suggests the kinds of broader uncertainties that Peale and his contemporaries were grappling with when they were imagining the role that museums might play. So even as we see these kinds of fears on the surrounding loss and erasure, on the side of those forming museum, we also must confront the way that Peale and his fellow curators were also part of erasing valuable knowledge. So here is just one example of a set of silhouettes of visitors to Peale's museum in 1806. These are attributed to Peale and his sons. It's also possible that they were done by the Black artist Moses Williams, who also worked at the museum and frequently cut many of the silhouette profiles that visitors took as souvenirs. These are also one of the few documenting sources of a tour of Peale's museum by a visiting Native American delegation in 1806. This was not the first time that the museum had hosted Native visitors, and during negotiations with the federal government in the 1790s, newspapers reported on their tours of the galleries. But after these silhouettes were made, Peale sent them to Thomas Jefferson, noting their, quote, interesting characters by the lines of their faces. While he documented some names, this silhouette also shows the kinds of information that were lost even in the moment of exchange. Here we see a number 10, rather than a name, a person transformed into an object to be read rather than a speaking subject. So there are many ways to read these portraits, but I was especially interested in them as documents of this visit to the museum. If you look more closely, and it's a little bit hard to see on this image, but just below the silhouette, you can see a museum stamp below the outline, which adds another dimension to the image quite literally. And it reminds us of these human figures within the space of the gallery, opens up questions about how they understood and interpreted objects. And much like the missing information on this record, it signals various forms of dispossession. By bringing together in imagining these varied kinds of objects and points of view, from curators and collectors to writers and visitors, I want to argue that we can think more fully about how early American museums were contributing to broader discussions about preservation, loss, longevity and stability, education and entertainment, and about the very purpose of a museum at a moment when that was still very much up for debate. So the afterlives of these collections have really shaped the ways that the objects have continued to be interpreted. Their later history was really shaped by shifts during the 19th century towards specialization and the rise of individual disciplines and fields. As the century wore on, many museums tended to be divided into collections of natural history, technology, and art, and to be separated off from libraries in many cases. Most of the objects that remain from the American Philosophical Society cabinet are now at the Penn Museum or the Academy of Natural Sciences, divided up by anthropology and natural history, respectively. And in the greater Boston area, many of the anthropological materials that were donated to places like the Massachusetts Historical Society or to the AAS are now at the Peabody Museum at Harvard, although both institutions continue to maintain some objects from their original cabinets. But although many collections have been divided across libraries, archives, and different kinds of museums, they were once housed together, and it's really important for us to recognize this early history. We can better see the kinds of concerns and anxieties that were hugely influential in shaping the trajectory of museums through to the present day. We can imagine and put in conversation the different points of view of founders and visitors, and we can also recognize the shared histories of collections dedicated to science, history, and art, even if today they're at different institutions. So in this way, perhaps we can build on and expand the possibilities for interpreting and engaging with collections today. The founders of 19th century museums often like to imagine what they called the spark that could result from placing different objects in fields of knowledge in conversation. They sometimes describe this process of collision between different objects and among the different minds and perspectives of those engaging with them. Throughout this period, the objects housed within museum cabinets and cases spurred many visitors to imagine continued possibilities for drawing new kinds of connections among them. But the founding of museums also set in motion much larger and unresolved questions about how we determine what to value, study, and preserve, as well as the kinds of loss and erasure that accompanied each step of that history. These debates continue to this day as museums think about what it might mean to decolonize collections, engage broader audiences, and highlight underrepresented histories. So here I would turn back to African American Picture Gallery, where we started, and its imagined vision for the future. Even as it illustrates these dynamic relationships between museums and visitors and readers, it also offers a more expansive notion of what could count as useful than what many of Wilson's contemporaries had yet imagined. By considering how these questions were being discussed throughout the 19th century, I think that we can better understand the longer history of these debates today and how they continue to inform many of the challenges that continue to face museums and other cultural institutions. This history reminds us of the patterns of loss and erasure that occurred in making these collections, of elitism and exclusion that limited access to knowledge, and the continually fraught questions about who determines what and how to preserve. And we can continue to be challenged to acknowledge this history and to seek out better and more inclusive ways today. But I also want to suggest, just by way of conclusion, how interdisciplinary work can also inform that process. If we recall the connections between collections, the proximities between books and the specimens and artifacts, and the possibilities for different kinds of interpretation that can be opened up by placing them in conversation, we can also think about the new sorts of stories that we might tell. And by thinking in these ways, we can also consider objects from new vantage points and open up new possibilities for interpreting collections and raising questions about their value and purpose. So I want to conclude just by noting some of the resonances between these different periods of change and transformation in the history of museums. Much like the transitional moment of the 19th century, museums have been in a moment of crisis and transition, especially over the last 2 years. But it also means that it's a dynamic moment for thinking about how the priorities of institutions can continue to evolve and change, and how museums can be thinking creatively about interdisciplinary forms of interpretation and education. By including a broader range of voices in the conversation, I would argue that today's museums can continue to build on this legacy by envisioning new opportunities for making collections more broadly useful. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and our conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. There's a lot of questions I think that your talk stirs. As a reminder to folks, the Q&A is open. So you can submit your questions there at any time, and I'll begin to read those off as they appear. Reed, I'd like to jump right in while we're waiting for some of those questions to arrive now. One of the things I think that really struck me by reading your book is how thoughtfully and how effectively you navigate through the complexities and ever-changing state of the museum, as well as ideas surrounding the collecting process. In particular, I think you noted in the beginning, there are, I think, two themes that really emerge in the book that center around power and control of knowledge and narrative. And then the other around philosophies around what's worth collecting and preserving and how we do that. You not only kind of investigate how institutions were founded, which I'd maybe like to get to in a little bit, but also kind of how they evolved and how they were recorded by visitors, how visitors reacted and interpreted their collections. You note in the book, these reactions come in all sorts of forms, from newspapers and guidebooks to novels to poetry, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch. Understandably, control over collections and the visitors and visitors' accounts are dominated by white men. However, they weren't the only ones that you note in the book. I'm wondering, could you share some of the examples of accounts by those representing lower classes of people, women, formerly enslaved people, indigenous people, et cetera?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And I mean, I think that it was a question that I was grappling with, throughout my research for this project and the writing of this book. In part because, as you just pointed out, so many of the writings of museum founders and visitors are going to be dominated by the voices of white men. I mean, who had the most access to these institutions, who was able to be a member of something like the American Philosophical Society, like that question of who gets to participate in the conversation, I think is something that we can see playing out in many of the accounts and descriptions of visits to museums during this time period. And so that's something that I was definitely thinking about a lot, and something that I was really aware of as I was doing my own research as well. Where are opportunities to try and get a more complete sense of the experiences of women, of enslaved or recently free people, or of indigenous communities as well. I mean, I included the silhouette in my discussion today because I think that it does offer, a really fascinating but also significant counterpoint to Peele's own self-portrait, which is a fairly famous work, of Peele lifting the velvet curtain to display his own museum. But how do we think about these different moments of portraiture and self-fashioning within the space of this gallery? And I think that that's where both the archival materials that I was able to access through places like the AAS were really significant. I think that being able to access, so many newspaper accounts, for example, I think was really important for this project. But also just really looking closely for accounts that were written by figures like Jane Johnston Schoolcraft or William Wells Brown. So Schoolcraft is kind of an interesting figure because her husband, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, was, as I mentioned in the talk, he was a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent, and he's really well known as an early salvage anthropologist. So he was really interested in writing and recording Native American legends and folktales, but he also was an avid collector, like many others of his time period. He was interested in numerous forms of collecting practice. So he had, a geology collection that he donated to what was then the Columbian Institute. This was one of several precursors to the Smithsonian based in DC. And he really talked about his writings often in similar language. He would describe specimens of literature and poetry and song. And so there are a lot of resonances across different kinds of fields for how we think about the work that he was doing. But he also relied heavily on his wife, Jane Johnston, and her family. So she was the daughter of an Ojibwe leader, and her family was really instrumental in providing a lot of the material and information that he needed to publish these works. So you see, sometimes he credits her, sometimes not so much. So we see collaboration, but we also see appropriation happening even in the making of these literary materials. But she was a writer herself. She was also a poet. And so in her own writings, we can see her occasionally kind of subtly talking back to this practice, or even in some of the stories that he's recorded. There are occasional moments, like kind of just glimpses of uncertainty, even in the head note or end note he might add to one of the stories that he has ostensibly recorded, that show a slight discomfort with what he's hearing, and it's like, I think it's in those moments that you can really see these different perspectives between the two of them, where you can see this collection acquisition process not only playing out across different kinds of materials, from geology and artifacts to literature, but also in the process of how they were negotiating this knowledge production. And I would also add just another example. I mentioned William Wells Brown earlier, but his tours of the British Museum were really, important in his travel narrative, 3 years in Europe, to how he's self-fashioning as an intellectual. He's talking about his education. He's really framing this as an important moment for how he, presents himself as a cultural critic. And so you can see here how the space of the museum is one where he's really, looking to assert himself, even if opportunities are more limited at home. And there are plenty of other examples I could talk about from the book, and I'd be happy to say more, but I want to make sure we have time for other questions you might have.
Perfect. And we'll let folks go out and find the book for themselves as well. So we'll leave it on a cliffhanger. I should have kind of, I jumped right into, bringing in the voices of others, of those, who were marginalized. But we have a question here that kind of takes a step back a little bit. Who visited 19th century museums? Were museums seen as entertainment, as they sometimes are today? I think you do address this in the book, this question of research versus entertainment versus education. And what about museums specifically for children?
Absolutely. Well, that's such a great question, because I think that this balance between research and entertainment and education, I think, is one that is really like playing out at really every institution during this time period, but especially across the 19th century. Because, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, I do think that a lot of the collections that are being established kind of within and around libraries and archives, like, that objects are really being imagined to function for research. You're going to consult them, you're going to investigate, look closely. And you see this in later museums as well, the academic collections at places like Harvard. And so there is some continuity there across the century of this imagined research purpose. But at the same time, that is always in conversation with this sense of what educational mission a museum can provide, and also the role that entertainment plays. And I think that, as I sort of alluded to in the talk with Peale's museum, and it's in the relationship with the American Philosophical Society, like, this wasn't, there were definitely moments of slight tension there. Is Peale's museum, a little too far on the entertainment side? There's this moment in the records where they talk about, like, allowing some objects to be loaned to Peale for his museum, but making sure they want there to be a placard that says who this belongs to. And there's this great moment. It's the meeting minutes where they talk about how they maturely weighed all circumstances. And I just think that's such a good, it's like, if you have to write that down, it's not a good sign. But you get this sense of this tension, this anxiety of how are these museums going to balance between these competing the competing goals, but also this sense of, is this meant to be entertaining, or is it meant to be quote unquote serious? And I think that's something that's playing out throughout the 19th century, especially when you think about museums, not only as being very close in their goals and their purpose to a library, but also to some of the more theatrical performances or spaces that they're also in close proximity to. So I think there's always this negotiation. And in some ways, I think that's something that has continued all the way up to today as well.
Yeah, I was actually just kind of thinking of that section in your book where you're actually mentioning exhibits like the Fiji mermaid and the like, and kind of that balancing act of, you know, the performative and hoax versus the much more serious and
Absolutely
refined. Here's another question that talks about asks about the separation between libraries and museums. And I know in your book, the word museum is so broadly defined because it has so many different applications and interpretations and spaces that give way to it. You mentioned, you know, everything from libraries and art galleries to more traditional museum exhibition spaces to even gardens. So Frank Jenkins here asks, can you speak to the separation of libraries and museums specifically? And it seems that more of a combination would better explain both artifacts and books.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. It's something that I've been really interested in. It's something I'd really like to explore further too, because I think that there is this moment kind of in the mid 19th century that I mentioned towards the end of the talk, where, you know, a number of these institutions that today I think do function a little bit more as libraries. Like I'm thinking of the Boston Athenaeum or you know, the Massachusetts Historical Society, you know, institutions that still have some objects in their collection, but at some point make a decision to, you know, really focus on developing the library. And in a place like the American Philosophical Society, I mean, I think to some extent there, as in other institutions, like some of this was determined by, you know, the work of individuals, right? That if you had somebody who was, you know, really intent on acquiring more materials for the library and really prioritizing that financially within the institution too, or even in the kinds of space that you had to house and display materials, I think that definitely played a role. But it also, I think, really does correspond to issues of disciplinary specialization, right? So this sense that, you know, a natural history collection would be better suited to, you know, one of the natural history museums that now has been relatively recently founded, and, you know, those materials can go there and be part of that collection and contribute to that area. And same with some of the kinds of anthropological collections that now went to like Harvard's museum, for example, from a number of different Boston, Massachusetts area institutions. And again, I mean, I think some of that had to do with the draw of individuals, like at Harvard, you know, the role of Frederick Ward Putnam founding the Peabody Museum and really using his own personal network to kind of draw in a lot of these collections. But I think that speaks to disciplinary formation, kind of broadly speaking. But the question for me is that I do kind of wonder about like what some of those internal debates look like, or if there's a way to figure out at that moment what this really, especially about like deaccessioning collections or about, you know, this decision to move certain materials elsewhere. And I think that that's something that I hope to continue to dive into, because I think that as this really great question points out, like I think it is a fascinating question for how we think about not only like the relationship between libraries and museums, but also like the different kinds of materials that we think of as, you know, being resources for, you know, especially at a library, like for the writing of history, right? Like what happens if material objects are excluded from that picture versus included? Like if you're prioritizing written records, like what kinds of things get left out too? So there are a lot of different dimensions to that question.
Here's a question, and maybe we can rope in a larger response about the ways in which different museums were founded. You know, between the large, you know, city museums that were founded by, you know, wealthy capitalists versus the more localized organizations. But Bob Frischman asks, isn't a key issue that American museums never receive public funds, unlike those in Europe? Doesn't this feed the elitism of our museums? Do you support, quote, public museums like the Louvre and British Museum? You might have mentioned that Peel actually sought to nationalize his museum, but elected officials didn't agree that it was important enough. So.
Yeah, that is also such a great question. So, you know, one thing to think about is in the early 19th century, when James Smithson made his bequest to the US government, this was the bequest that ultimately led to the funding of the Smithsonian Institution named for him. there was a pretty robust debate about what the best use of this money would be. The idea that it was going to become a museum like the Smithsonian was not a foregone conclusion. And at the time, there were a lot of different proposals for what it would look like, what the best way to sort of preserve and promote knowledge would look like before settling on a museum. I mean, there was talk of universities, of libraries, of an observatory, so this idea of a museum receiving public funding, I think that question really did play out in some of the debates about the Smithsonian. In terms of like the founding of these larger institutions and the corporate capitalism behind them in the late 19th century, I also think I think that that's a really interesting moment to think about in relation to this earlier period. Most of those museums were founded after the Civil War, during the Gilded Age. They were very much intended to look like European art museums, for example, like the Louvre, like the National Gallery. But I think that's a period in museum building that looked very different from some of these earlier, I think, as you put it, more local, smaller institutions. And I think that I've been really interested in kind of putting these in conversation and also trying to sort of trace like how we got to some of these bigger museums, because I think that there was a lot of back and forth in terms of how the purpose of a museum, the collections were being imagined. I think as I mentioned earlier, this negotiation between like research and education and entertainment, I think that you could add the terms that you're mentioning here about the kind of public and private, like that's also something that's being negotiated, and that I don't think that there's a kind of linear trajectory to it, right? We're zigzagging a bit on those questions throughout the first half of the 19th century. And I think the fact that there isn't a linear progression is also important, because it lets us see how these questions are being negotiated, and how there isn't necessarily a growing consensus. And perhaps that's also part of where we end up with more privately funded institutions, is that, there hasn't been the same kind of momentum towards them. And so by the Civil War, in order to create some of these institutions, you're still relying on more private forms of funding. So there's lots to say about that question. It's a really great question. Thank you.
Like a transition to 19th century women specifically. Did women establish any collections in the early Republic? What were some of the earliest collections gathered or curated by women?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, I think it's really important to think about. I, of course, think that this is important. I will say, I think you put a link in the chat to the exhibit that I recently curated about the women working behind the scenes at Harvard's museum. But, I think that it's, there were definitely women, especially I'm thinking in Europe or in England, specifically Mary Anning, I think is a really great example of, a fossil collector whose collections were really important for, a number of the major natural history museums in England in the 19th century. Other collectors of shells, for example, you can see the role that women were playing in developing their own collections, especially elite, noble women who had the money and resources to do so. In the US, I think one thing that I've been especially interested in is the role that women were playing often as unsung, under-acknowledged, invisible labor, because they were doing a lot of work like that. For many women, these collections were not part of larger institutions. I've written elsewhere about the collection of Ellen Sewell Osgood, some of whose family papers are at the AAS, and a geology collection that she made, in part supported with objects and even a box to house it, by her friend Henry David Thoreau. But you see women, I think Britt Russert has talked has written really wonderfully about Sarah Mapps Douglas, a Black woman in Philadelphia in the 19th century, who maintained a cabinet of natural history collections in her parlor as part of a school that she taught. And I mentioned Ora White Hitchcock, whose drawings she illustrated her husband's scientific publications and also created these really amazing classroom drawings, like kind of the painted canvas equivalent to our modern day PowerPoint. But she, you see these examples of women often working outside of institutions, in part because they weren't allowed to join them. But you can still kind of recover the work that they were doing. You can think about, these alternate forms of scientific practice that they had as well. And then you can also see increasingly as, larger institutions like the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, like the Smithsonian, as these are being established and they're developing a staff, they do hire women to work as assistants. They're just hiring them in the lower paid roles where their names aren't going to appear on the publications, and they don't appear in, the photographs of the curators of the museum. So yeah, there's lots to say there. And I think still a lot of work to be done to recover the kinds of work they were doing.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to transition now from women's role in these museums to traveling menageries. And the question is, what are your thoughts on the wide influence of the large traveling menageries of the late 1820s through 1840s? But continuing as part as the many major circuses that published highly illustrated booklets describing the animals and sometimes citing Buffon, for example. The question continues: the Zoological Institute of 1835 to 1837, for example, outfitted several exhibitions that went 2,000 miles into the interior of Africa. The dozen or so menageries of this time period attracted huge numbers of patrons. So
that's such a great question. In terms of the museums that I focus on in the book, I focused less on menageries, but I think, as I was mentioning earlier, like it's really important to think about like the museum as being like the museum within like this like larger constellation of different kinds of spaces and entertainments. And I think that there are a lot of resonances there, especially as you move from the 19th into the 20th century and up to today, like as we think about the relationship between something like a natural history museum, a zoo, a park, and so forth. Like you can see really the roots of that exactly in these menageries as well. Like as you're thinking about what are the different spaces where people might encounter, ideas about nature or even animals, right? Like how could you think about the relationship between these kinds of spaces, but also like how they're being invited to engage differently with, with the living collections versus, the collections of a natural history museum. I think that it's something that somebody like Thoreau is really invested in as he's thinking about the work that he does collecting specimens and donating them to natural history museums. Like this question about like what kinds of value and information, like what contribution to scientific knowledge can you get by looking at a still specimen versus a living creature, I think is something that he's really grappling with and struggling with, ethically speaking. And it's actually something that a lot of other naturalists were dealing with as well. And I think that your comment too about like these illustrated publications that were circulating and really popular alongside the menageries, like these illustrated natural history textbooks are also around the same time starting to point out like maybe you don't need a gun to observe natural history like Audubon. Maybe you can use the beautiful color plates, illustrations in this slightly expensive book to observe nature instead, right? And so they're looking to other forms of technology and representation, and they're also thinking about other ways of circulating information. So I think that in terms of your question, like I do think that it speaks to the kind of proximity between these different kinds of spaces and how we might put them in conversation. So thank you for that.
We have several more questions, and I of course will forward them to you. We do not have time to get to all of them, unfortunately. One final question, though, before we kind of wrap things up for today. Your book covers the 19th century broadly. I'm thinking specifically about, that big event that happens right in the middle of the century, the Civil War. How did the Civil War actually shape or redirect interests in or opinions on museums? Specifically, I'm thinking about, one of these major themes of loss and preservation that, comes up time and again in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. As I mentioned before, a lot of museums are founded just after the Civil War. So, I think that it is a kind of watershed moment for how we think about, the kind of before and after of the large art and natural history museums of the 1870s. That said, I mean, I think that there are, as you're pointing out, like a lot of opportunities to think about continuities and the way that some of the, both the ideas about loss and preservation are continuing from, the 1790s and 1820s all the way through the 1850s and 60s, but also about how museums continue to be grappling with similar kinds of issues too. And I think that you see that especially in the US Patent Office Gallery. I gave this example earlier in the slides, which is actually transformed into a Civil War hospital. And so you can really see in that space how, the kinds of ideals about presenting knowledge and like orderly government bureaucracy and invention and all of these ideals about what it means to, convey American ingenuity are really being tested and colliding very visibly with the human cost of the war. And so I think that you see that within those spaces, but you also can see, I think you can see a lot of the, these questions anticipating the war and really kind of continuing throughout the 19th century.
Thank you so much. With that, I would like to conclude our program, and Reed, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for such wonderful questions. It was really a pleasure.
That's great. As a reminder, there are links in the chat related to how you can find Reed's book, a discount code for it for Oxford University Press, as well as several links for upcoming programs. As a reminder, this talk will be published on the AAS YouTube channel in the coming weeks. I encourage attendees today to complete the evaluation form that will be included in the chat, and to check out future AAS programs by signing up for our History of the Book mailing list. Our next program will take place at 7 p.m. on Thursday, March 3rd, and features artist Jasmine Lee Johnson as she discusses her project Contraband, an ongoing body of work drawn from her research as a creative artist fellow here at AAS. Work from a number of our artists and creative writers also was recently featured in the literary journal, The Worcester Review, last week. If you can check that out, fantastic. On Thursday, March 10th at 7 p.m., Roberto Sabo, Assistant Professor of American Studies at Wesleyan, will discuss his new book, American Mirror, the United States and Brazil in the Age of Emancipation. This is going to be conducted as a conversation with Manisha Sinha, Chair of American History at the University of Connecticut and 2020 Distinguished Scholar in Residence here at AAS. Finally, two upcoming programs from the history of the book here. Our next book talk will take place on March 31st at the usual 2 p.m. time slot. Our guest is Hannah Farber, Assistant Professor of History at Columbia, who will discuss her first book, Underwriters of the United States: How Insurance Shaped the American Founding. And then finally, for folks who haven't yet seen this, I'm very delighted to announce and share that AAS and the program in the history of the book will host a summer seminar this July entitled Black Print, Black Activism, Black Study. It is led by Derek Spires and Ben Fagan. For more information, there is a link available in the chat. Deadline for applications is April 1st. If there are any questions, please reach out to me directly. In the meantime, thanks to one and all for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you have a great semester, and I will see you next time.